Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, thank you very much to all for coming to this important event. In honor of the first annual commemoration at the United Nations of the International Chernobyl Disaster Remembrance Day, the Permanent Mission of Belarus to United Nations, Project Chernobyl, and the Russian-American Foundation are pleased and honored to present the roundtable discussion identifying and mitigating long-term consequences of the Chernobyl nuclear accident, building the case for continued international cooperation. My name is Igor Branovan. I'm the founder and president of Project Chernobyl, and I'm very honored to moderate this very interesting discussion. Today, we all mark the 31st anniversary of the worst peacetime nuclear disaster in the history of the world, the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, at that time at the Soviet Union on the 26th of April, 1986. The number 31 may not seem significant, but it is auspicious because in some respect it symbolizes the persistence and the determination of the international community in responding to and mitigating both the short-term and the long-term sequelae of the accident. Today we'll have the opportunity to hear from representatives of the affected nations to the UN, leaders of the UN agencies involved in the mitigation of the Chernobyl accident, leaders of organizations assisting Chernobyl victims, and some of the world's leading scientists in the fields of endocrinology, epidemiology, molecular genetics, and others who study the consequences of the accident on the affected population. One of the principal lessons to be learned from today's roundtable discussion is that the international response to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident is undoubtedly one of the most remarkable examples of comprehensive global response to the technological accident. And the international community should remain vigilant and united, considering the long-term consequences of such disasters, as well as the risk of other disaster events. Much work remains to be done to help affected regions and communities to realize their full development potential. Achieving sustainable development goals in Chernobyl-affected regions through partnerships, innovations, and investments is a sensible and topical idea to form the core of further recovery work. The international Chernobyl agenda, in our opinion, should include cooperation in knowledge management and policy advice, as well as risk management and radiation mitigation. With all respect, please let me welcome you all to this important event, and we look forward to an interesting and very consequential roundtable discussion. Thank you very much. I would like to invite Mr. Dmitry Mirochik, Head of Department of Information, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, to present his discussion.
Dear colleagues, I'm pleased to greet you at today's meeting, an important discussion in a row of events dedicated to the International Chernobyl Disaster Remembrance Day. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you some observations on practices related to the international cooperation on Chernobyl under the UN auspices, its achievements and difficulties. First of all, I would like to stress the importance of effective Chernobyl cooperation between the most affected countries and of the coordination mechanism embodied in the UN Interagency Task Force on Chernobyl led by the UNDP. Our experience shows that UNDP is uniquely positioned to coordinate UN agencies' efforts at the development stage of recovery from the Chernobyl disaster. Its presence on the ground and close partnership with national and local authorities ensures an effective implementation of its projects and first-hand knowledge. The UN General Assembly resolution on Chernobyl, adopted last December, recognizes the persistent legacy of the Chernobyl disaster and empowers the United Nations system to undertake meaningful steps aimed at achieving the sustainable development goals in the Chernobyl-affected regions and communities. Achieving SDGs in the affected regions through partnerships innovations and investments seems a topical idea to form the core of the post-2016 period. Belarus is counting on the strong leadership and coordination functions of the UNDP and the UN Interagency Task Force on Chernobyl in implementing that. Our country highly values the continued efforts of the UNDP and the International Atomic Energy Agency aimed at implementing of the specific Chernobyl-related projects. The International Atomic Energy Agency database of best practices devoted to cost-effective countermeasures in agriculture and forestry, as well as the UNDP Knowledge Project Recovery from Chernobyl Experiences and Lessons Learned, are in demand in Belarus. There is considerable potential for cooperation with the WHO regarding maintaining and strengthening of the healthcare systems in affected regions, long-term medical follow-up of exposed populations. The Secretariat of the World Health Organization may consider it appropriate to study within its mandate medical consequences of the Chernobyl disaster with a view to improve the understanding of low-dose radiation risks for human health and to increase the effectiveness of medical assistance to individuals residing in the radioactive contaminated areas. There are also things which Belarus can share with the world through its knowledge and experience. Our country is proud of her achievements in the post-Chernobyl rehabilitation. From Japan, Germany, Norway, France, China, Korea, we note a significant and sustainable demand for our knowledge and experience related to permissible doses, zoning, people's psychological rehabilitation, etc. Since 1988, Belarus possesses a unique research facility in the exclusion zone, the State Radiation and Ecology Reserve Polessia. The evaluation of the barrier functions of this reserve, the natural recovery processes and justification of possible additional protection measures should be an important task of national and international research. The already obtained research results show a high promise of such endeavors. Given that, we intend to establish an international research center for study of long-term consequences of the Chernobyl disaster in this reserve. This research center could be financed through a special international fund. Experts from different states would be able to work jointly in such a center, taking part in research programs that are of fundamental significance. We invite all UN member states, the United Nations specialized institutions, state, public and business entities, foreign nationals to participate in the establishment and activities of the center. In conclusion, I would like to stress that Belarus is grateful to the agencies, US funds, and specialized institutions, other international organizations, civil society entities, foreign nationals, for their solidarity and support in the elimination of Chernobyl consequences. We express our appreciation to the leadership of the UNDP for having served as a coordinator on Chernobyl since 2004 and for its contribution to the strengthening of the international cooperation in this field. We are thankful to other organizations, in particular the humanitarian organizations, which have worked hand in hand with us over all these years. Belarus is ready to cooperate closely with all those who are ready to do so in the field of mitigation of the Chernobyl consequences and experience exchange. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mironchik. Our next presenter is Sergei Konuchenko, Deputy Permanent Representative to the Russian Federation to the United Nations. Please.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I would like to begin with expressing appreciation to the Republic of Belarus for organizing this event, as well for its consistent efforts to keep the Chernobyl cooperation on the forefront of the UN development agenda. As a member of Troika, we fully support these endeavors. Last year marked the 30th anniversary of Chernobyl. For 3 decades, the international community has been providing joint, targeted, and comprehensive response to overcome the consequences of the breakdown. We all learned our lessons from the incident and attached significant efforts to ensure that Chernobyl effects are properly mitigated and people affected receive the international support they need. We were encouraged to see that the recent UNJ resolution on persistent legacy of Chernobyl was adopted unanimously, with dozens of states joining as co-sponsors, including the Russian Federation. That clearly indicates that commitment of international community to the restoration of affected territories in line with the Minsk Ministerial Declaration of April 2016, and in this sense, the resolution lays the foundation for a new period of Chernobyl cooperation that would succeed the 2016 decade of action. The Russian Federation stands ready to extend participation in the activities on Chernobyl restoration. Being actively engaged in targeted projects implemented in the affected territories, we stand ready to further utilize our science and technological potential for the sake of overcoming the long-term consequences of the breakdown under the able leadership of UNDP. We join others in commending implementing partners for the timely completion of the first phase of the shelter project. The Russian Federation contributes $5 million for the realization of the project in 2017 and looks forward to successful completion of the second phase of this ambitious project. Significant results were also achieved in the Russian Federation. Following years of decontamination activities, several Chernobyl-affected zones in our country changed their status back to normal, allowing inter alia full-scale agricultural production. The government's policy is now aimed at accumulation of investments in the development of these territories to overcome the losses occurred due to previous constraints, as well to integrate those territories in the national economy. That fully corresponds to the goals of the Minsk Declaration and provides a good basis for international experience sharing. Given the comprehensive theme of today's roundtable, I would also like to touch upon the issue which is often raised during deliberations on Chernobyl's aftermath. It's the future of nuclear energy and its safety. The events of 1986 gave impetus to a series of scientific studies and the development of practical solutions aimed at enhancing the safety of nuclear objects. Since then, a lot has been achieved to safeguard the atomic energy as a working and sustainable option for the diversification of energy mix, which effectiveness and reliability still far exceeds the available alternative energy solutions. Therefore, we persistently advocate for further consolidation of scientific knowledge and sharing of best practices in nuclear safety under the post-2016 Chernobyl cooperation. We are also pleased to recognize that these issues were given due consideration during the Disaster Risk Conference in Sendai, which for the first time addressed the need to prevent man-made disasters. Herewith, I would like to specifically commend our colleagues from Belarus for arranging a side event at the Sendai conference dedicated to prevention measures at the nuclear power plants based on the lessons learned from Chernobyl and Fukushima. The deliberations we had back then clearly indicated that professionals operating on the power plants with up-to-date safety measures in place feel safe and the potential risks are minimized. Another aspect of nuclear power which raises lots of uneasy discussions is the management of nuclear wastes. And again, the solution lies mainly in the implementation of modern technologies and practices. For years of exploitation of nuclear power plants, the Russian Federation managed to elaborate a whole range of sustainable solutions for waste processing, and we remain eager to share those practices with the rest of the world. Just recently, for instance, we supported a UNDP project on rehabilitation of uranium storages in the Kyrgyz Republic, which was implemented in partnership with the Russian Atomic Energy Rosatom. So, like I said, there are issues in relation to nuclear energy which need to be raised and thoroughly discussed. That would guarantee that the decisions taken are well informed and possible concerns are properly addressed. We are open to such dialogue, both under the umbrella of Chernobyl cooperation and at large. To conclude, I would like to pay tribute to hundreds of thousands of Chernobyl liquidators who gave up their lives and well-being for the sake of future generations. On the occasion of 30th anniversary, our government has organized a series of commemoration events, including exhibitions and documentaries across the country. The scale and outreach of these events, as well as the public interest they accumulated, shows that the heroic deed of those people is not forgotten. We will make all possible efforts to make sure that those affected by Chernobyl continue to enjoy social protection policies and benefits under the federal programs implemented across the Russian Federation. And finally, I would like to express appreciation to UNDP and personally to its previous administrator, Madame Helen Clark, for her distinguishable efforts to keep the high profile of the Chernobyl dossier. We hope that the new administrator would extend his support to Chernobyl cooperation, taking into account its essential meaning for the sustainable development of the affected countries. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kononchenko. I'd like to welcome Mr. Lenny Montiel, Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development, UNDSA. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Let me thank the government of Belarus, the project Chernobyl, as well as the Russian-American Foundation for the organization of this event. Ladies and gentlemen, 31 years ago, on 26th of April 1986, an explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear reactor quickly cascaded into the worst nuclear accident the world has ever seen. Today, we remember this tragedy and its victims. Chernobyl was a man-made disaster, a disaster that was avoidable. When disaster struck, the extent and precise nature of its impact was not well known or fully anticipated. However, it clearly impacted millions across Europe. As many as 115,000 people were evacuated and 220,000 resettled. The assessment carried out by the Chernobyl Forum, thanks to thousands of scientists, has also provided a quantitative picture of the enormity of the impact. Death, debilitating outcomes such as thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other diseases. one of the most widespread and deepest impacts has been on psychological and mental health. Most sadly, the impacts spans generations. Sussex and ETH Zurich researchers estimate the overall cost of the Chernobyl accident at a whopping US dollars 259 billion. This is a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chernobyl accident was a terrible man-made tragedy. Have we learned from it? After 31 years of international cooperation, are we in a better position to assess, understand, and prevent technological calamities of this kind in the future? What kind of risk are we willing to take? How do they compare with the technological benefits? Are there alternatives, and what are the risk-reward profiles in comprehensive terms? We live in a time of powerful technologies and exponential innovation. In our view, it is paramount that the international community answer these questions, not only from nuclear energy technologies, but also for the range of emerging technologies that can be crucial for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. In the context of the Global Sustainable Development Report 2016, scientists identified opportunities and threats of a range of emerging bio, digital, nano, neuro, and green technologies. Just to give one example, automation technologies, robotics, and artificial intelligence are expected to have many benefits, but also potentially carry great risks. Experts recently brought together by our department, DESA, highlighted the fact that very little is known, especially in terms of the potential positive and negative impacts of these new technologies on developing countries. If we are serious about the aspirations of the Sustainable Development Goals, we cannot afford to fly blindly with any idea of the impacts of the new technologies and possible responses. While technology progress in the past has solved many ills and problems, it has also always added ever new challenges. Technological change is potentially disruptive. However, we do not have unlimited time for trial and error. Human life and well-being cannot be treated with negligence. Ladies and gentlemen, it is against this background that I wish to call on all interested partners to work together to systematically assess, develop, and share knowledge about the powerful new technologies of today. Many have the potential to drive the kind of transformations called for by the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, many also expose mankind to unforeseen threats. Together, we can better understand and anticipate issues and flexibly adapt policies much more effectively than without such cooperation. It is about making the knowledge and factual evidence available for decision makers. Member States wisely created a technology facilitation mechanism in the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Agenda. I believe this mechanism can and should provide the space to start such cooperation in earnest on key emerging technologies for the SDGs. We encourage you all to consider engaging in the technology facilitation mechanism. The multi-stakeholder forum on science, technology, and innovation for the SDG, to be held from 15 to 16 May, will be a good opportunity to discuss next steps for emerging technologies, particularly related to nuclear application and safety, as well as energy technologies. If there is one lesson for me from the Chernobyl accident, it is that it was not inevitable. Losing precious life and scaring others for generations was not inevitable. And it is clear to me, to us here in this building, that many actions need to be taken to do our due diligence in managing the risks associated with emerging technologies that will be crucial for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. This was clear from reference made in the statement by Mr. Mironchik and by His Excellency Mr. Kananuchenko. Once again, I congratulate the government of Belarus for organizing the discussion on this highly important topic. Our thoughts are with the victims for the Chernobyl accident. We also join Mr. Kananuchenko in the acknowledgement of heroes that helped fighting this accident several years ago. We can prevent these kinds of man-made disasters, and I am convinced that together we will. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Montiel, for that impassioned speech. I'd like to invite Ruslan Butrikov, Deputy Permanent Representative, Minister Counselor of the Permanent Mission of Kazakhstan to the United Nations.
I thank you, Mr. Moderator. I thank Government of Belarus, Project Chernobyl, and Russian-American Foundation for making us reflect on the tragedy of Chernobyl and the lessons learned. We have a deep understanding of such tragedy, since Kazakhstan too suffered a similar, horrific, but somewhat different situation. I refer to the 40 years of nuclear detonation in which more than 1 million of my people were affected by nuclear and radiological contamination, and which devastated the entire eastern part of our country around Semipalatinsk. Kazakhstan has thus been a close partner in the Chernobyl rehabilitation process over the last 3 decades, contributing financial resources as well as humanitarian assistance. We express our profound appreciation to the UN family of organizations, member states, other international partners, chief among them being the UNDP, International Atomic Energy Agency, international financial institutions, as well as NGOs, for taking active part in this process. The consequences of such disasters are sobering and bind us together into serious collective action. The events of 30 years ago and Japan's in 2011 have many lessons to teach. The consequences of Chernobyl are so catastrophic that only international collaboration addressed the mitigation and rehabilitation processes extending into decades. Permit me to recount our story and bring some consideration on this regard. Firstly, the removal of more than 1,000 nuclear warheads from my country, as well as rehabilitation of the Semipalatinsk territory and the Chernobyl reconstruction project are examples of successful international collaboration. It shows that despite divergences, countries can work together for a common cause. International assistance and scientific cooperations was many-sided in the areas of healthcare, agriculture, economic revival, information activity, rehabilitation of the population, especially children, and many other humanitarian projects. We learned that for the future we need to develop international cooperation in the field of emergency prevention and rapid response, effective system of alerting and notifications, protection of the food chain, decontaminating settlements, treating pasture, and providing clean fodder to farm. This is especially This is especially necessary in a globalized, interconnected world of transnational supply and demand. I mention this because we could mobilize that same spirit of solidarity and synergy to address today's challenges for our collective global security, not only in abolishing nuclear weapons, but overcoming other scourges that beset us today. Secondly, we witness the rapid expansion of the nuclear energy industry, which poses the potential threats of accidents in all nuclear plants, new or aging, as well as the foreboding prospects of nuclear terrorism. These thoughts compel us to have an emergency control system with an assessment program, together with international nuclear safety control mechanisms. Kazakhstan believes that all member states, irrespective of the existence of their nuclear infrastructure and capacities, should be involved in addressing the vital problems of nuclear safety and security by following the recommendations of the 4 nuclear security summits held in 2010 in Washington, 2012 in Seoul, 2014 The Hague, and in 2016 Washington, as well as 1542nd Review Conference. Today, over 60 countries possess nuclear energy with their accompanying risks. Kazakhstan has therefore worked diligently for the non-proliferation regime. A most recent significant step is that Kazakhstan will host the International Atomic Energy Agency law-enriched uranium bank. The bank will give states the right to peaceful nuclear energy and non-discriminatory access to nuclear fuel. Consequently, there will be no need for countries to enrich uranium in order to develop nuclear energy. Our world today is threatened by an upward spiral of terrorism and violent extremism. The perils of nuclear terrorism and technological accidents are real. Care must be taken to develop comprehensive and sustainable measures to prevent terrorist groups from acquiring nuclear weapons, their components, technologies, and radioactive materials. We strongly believe that taking practical steps towards general and complete nuclear disarmament is one of the key prerequisites for achieving effective nuclear security at the national, regional, and global levels. Kazakhstan has therefore hosted 2 workshops on the 1540 resolution towards this end with far-reaching impact. We, the states of Central Asia, have a special cohesion. In accordance with the Treaty of Semipalatinsk establishing the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, all 5 Central Asian states have pledged to maintain and continue to improve upon effective standards of physical protection with respect to nuclear materials, facilities, and equipment to prevent their unauthorized use, handling, or theft. Our international efforts and collaboration will have to gain momentum for the safety of our planet after the lessons of the Chernobyl and Fukushima through improved early warning, disaster risk reduction, and building resilience. Nuclear disasters, accidents, and terrorism would be a drastic and irrevocable setback to all of us. We have no option but to live together as one large family of the United Nations. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Botrikov. I'd like to invite Dr. Nata Minabde, Executive Director, Office of the United Nations WHO, please.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be here today and to offer WHO contribution to this important discussion on the consequences of the Chernobyl catastrophe, which has shocked the world at the time and continues to be in the memories of those who have been there at the time, but also is present in our today's discussions in many fora, not just this one. I'd like to especially thank the government of Belarus, the Project Chernobyl, and the Russian-American Foundation for organizing this and many other important events which bring together experts, specialists, politicians to discuss how to best handle those consequences. WHO has a long history of involvement in dealing with consequences of this Chernobyl event. Coincidentally, I started my work with WHO in 1994 when we first engaged in supporting government of Belarus, but also in collaboration with the Russian Federation and Ukraine to deal with some of the medical consequences, in particular the thyroid disease at the time. And we have been involved in monitoring, in collecting data, in providing medical care, and also conducting research on this very important topic. It was early first-line response of WHO to this. We have also supported development and establishment of very impressive, indeed, health infrastructure, as was mentioned by the previous speakers. In the second decade, our activities were mainly focused on coordination and support to dosimetry and some risk assessment studies. And in the third stage and third decade, we were dealing with information dissemination, risk communication training, and again, research and follow-up studies of the consequences. Long-term medical follow-up of the exposed population and cleanup workers in Chernobyl disaster is being continued by WHO collaborating centers in Kiev and in Obninsk, and WHO's International Agency for Research of Cancer in Lyon. We have been looking at various medical and cancer research studies, but we have also been establishing long-term surveillance over the victims. We have been looking at anxiety and psychosocial consequences of that. We have been looking also at non-cancer related medical consequences, and we have been looking at alleviation of stigma of populations that have been affected by this disaster. Following the development of a strategic research agenda, the IARC, WHO's cancer arm, completed the Coordination Action Cooperation on Chernobyl Health Research Co-Chair, a project that brought together key scientific players and funding bodies to take the Chernobyl research agenda forward. The priorities for a long-term research program have already been agreed, and at this stage, IARC is looking at the funding possibilities to convene a multinational body, which is instrumental to ensure sustainability of main research infrastructures, including creation of Chernobyl's lifespan cohort of affected populations and implementation of Chernobyl research program. This is very topical, very important current priority of our work. WHO also has provided its contribution to development of UN's post-2016 Chernobyl strategy. And among other items, we have supported establishment of international scientific network to study long-term consequences of Chernobyl and to mitigate psychosocial consequences of this nuclear accident. Psychosocial impact of disasters is very well documented, not just in Chernobyl's case, but in also many disasters that we are facing in the world today also. WHO is currently running an year-long campaign on mental health and well-being, and our World Health Day was this month celebrated also dedicated to depression. So, for those who have experienced disaster and emergency, the situation is particularly difficult because they are usually more vulnerable than the others. In the case of Chernobyl, the psychosocial impacts have been reported as the main public health impact of this disaster, affecting the largest number of people. And similar effect is now reported in the aftermath of Fukushima disaster, which caused evacuation and relocation of large group of people whose livelihoods were disrupted, and they have been displaced, and they have been lacking access to necessary essential services, including healthcare services. Ladies and gentlemen, 1 in 5 people in the situation of disasters are experiencing mental health disorders, various types. Depression doubles in the situation of disasters as compared to regular numbers of the depressed people all over the world. So we have these situations which require indeed a very special attention, very special care provision, and that is unfortunately less available in the situation of disasters as compared to regular settings. So we need to look and think about those things and find some solutions. It is critical to provide mental health services in disaster-affected areas. What is also important that those consequences in terms of psychosocial and mental health consequences, they don't just end after disaster is over. They actually continue and they manifest themselves many years following the event. It affects in the long term those families. So it is very important to provide adequate information to affected population, provide specialized psychosocial support programs, and continue this support through years and generations. To commemorate the 30th anniversary of Chernobyl accident, WHO IARC held a scientific symposium on Chernobyl health effects last year in June in Lyon, and 3 WHO collaborating centers hosted scientific conferences and workshops on commemoration with WHO's involvement, of course. WHO's engagement is ongoing, has been there all these years, and will continue to be there. Currently, today, through April, end of this month, April 30th, we have in WHO headquarters a photo exhibition with the government of Belarus. It's jointly organized, and there are all these photographs, some of them we see here, but they are exposed also in the WHO premises. On July 3rd, we are holding 15th meeting of WHO Global Network of Expert Institutions specialized in radiation emergency medical response and long-term follow-up of exposed populations. One of the meeting sessions is dedicated to the radiation-induced thyroid cancer and will review the experience of the 30 years of follow-up on Chernobyl populations. This is a very important issue at the moment in light of the vigorous discussions about pediatric thyroid cancers diagnosed in Fukushima children as well. So the evidence of Chernobyl is serving some other children in more recent disasters. WHO will work closely and continue to work closely with the governments and to help them to respond adequately to nuclear accidents if those happen, and to other radiological emergencies, and provide coordination and consultation on medical assistance to victims of such events where severe radiation exposure will occur. Additionally, WHO provides national authorities some advice on preparedness for those disasters and prevention also, and public health measures which need to be in place if such situations occur. In WHO's research coordination capacity, we aim to identify ionizing radiation research needs and to promote research in these key areas that will allow WHO to make better assessment of health risks associated to excessive exposure to ionizing radiation. WHO's radiation program is involved in a number of research projects related to health effects of this, including the International Radon Project, Global Burden of Disease Assessment, International Project on Health Effects of the Chernobyl Accident, Chernobyl Tissue Bank, and others. As a leading UN agency on health, we remain committed to cooperate on the implementation of post-2016 Chernobyl strategy. We must make sure that consequences of this tragedy are not forgotten, that lessons are learned, that victims receive the care that they need, and the research is conducted to benefit current and future generations. It takes solidarity, and this is one of those events of expressing this solidarity to the victims and to the countries who were affected by this tragedy, which is indeed, by all means, a global tragedy. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. WHO commits itself to continue collaboration with the affected governments and people for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these powerful words. I'd like to invite Dr. Valentina Drozd. Dr. Drozd is the head of International Department of Project Chernobyl. Her presentation is titled Drawing on the Lessons of Chernobyl to explain the dramatic rise in the incidence of thyroid cancer around the world in the past 30 years. Considerations about a combined carcinogenic effect of exposure to radiation and nitrates. Dr. Drozd.
How to make any PowerPoint presentation, how to, okay, start. Dear Chairman, dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank for inviting me for this very important event and giving the possibility to bring for this round table our knowledge which we accumulated during the last 30 years, working together in different international program and project together with our United States colleagues from Project Chernobyl, together with people from NCI, also in framework of Project WHO, IFICA, together with our Japanese colleagues and Germany scientists. We would like to share our knowledge and our experience, and we hope that our knowledge will be helpful and also very important to prevent the so tragic event as the Chernobyl accident. I would like to focus our attention today for a more important issue, which is really a result of radiation exposure. It's radiation-induced thyroid cancer. Now we know that the most serious consequence, medical consequence, Chernobyl accident. But 30 years after the Chernobyl accident, I would like focus not only attention on the radiation exposure. We should consider this problem from the different point of view, and accordingly we should take account our ecological situation. And I would like to discuss together this whole issue. When in Belarus, Belarusian scientists first reported in beginning of 19 our data, our situation in Belarus about the sharp increase in thyroid cancer cases. In the world, in the United States, in Japan, this experience and this data, these first articles were greeted very skeptically, because previous experience have shown that radioiodine it's not so dangerous from the point of view induction thyroid cancer. And when I first, in beginning of 19, I reported in the podium of WHO data about the pediatric thyroid cancer and dramatical increase in the incidence, the discussion was so strong, and my opponents said me that I so young and cannot understand the situation. And only 5 years later, after the first cases of thyroid cancer in children, the people from IAEA, the scientific society, was forced and should admit that it's real situation. In the world, we face the problem radio-induced thyroid cancer after radiation exposure by radioiodine. Now we have very good statistics, and we know that in Belarus the peak of morbidity among the children was in 1992, 1994. After that, the peak of morbidity shifted in the zone of adolescence, and it was in 2001, 2002. And now we can observe in Belarus the growing incidence of thyroid cancer, mostly among the young adults. But I would like attract its. We know that it's related to Chernobyl accident, to radiation exposure, but it's an open question about the hypothyroidism. Now in Belarus, we also observed very high increase in the incidence of hypothyroidism among the children, adolescents, and adults. And 10 times the incidence is higher. But what is the reason of this situation? This question is open for our investigation. I would like to give some facts about the thyroid cancer. Now the thyroid cancer incidence is growing in the world very dramatically, not only in Belarus, in the United States, also in Korea, and it's practically the type of cancer which is growing every year in the United States about 6%. The annual percent change is highest compared with the other type of cancers. Of course, we are this question under very strong discussion in the world, and some authors try to clarify the situation related only good diagnostic modalities and improving diagnostic, but other suggests consider also the other factors as our situation in environmental and exposure and endocrine disruptors. What we know about the reason of thyroid cancer? First of all, we know after Chernobyl accident very well that first reason is the exposure, and particular exposure in the childhood. It's the experience of Chernobyl accident, experience of Fukushima, and also the experience of nuclear weapon testing. Also, a very important role plays medical diagnostic examination with using the radiation methods. Also, very important information for us is recently published by WHO report about the role of endocrine disrupting chemicals. Some chemicals, for example, nitrates and other one, are responsible for the different type of endocrine-related cancers, also obesity, also metabolic disorders. It's this information we should take account to understand much better consequence of Chernobyl accident. In the same time, very important experience of Chernobyl to understand much better the situation in a world with a sharp increase in thyroid cancer cases. I would like to give some information about the experience which we got from the Chernobyl study, and we analyzed the data pediatric thyroid cancer. You can see that the highest rate of pediatric thyroid cancer was in Gomel region, and it's about 11. And it's absolutely understandable because the highest dose to thyroid gland was exactly in the Gomel. But in other oblasts, Mogilev and Brest, the mean thyroid dose was practically the same, but the incidence rate was 5 times higher in Brest. This discrepancy needs some clarification, and we involved in our analysis data of nitrate in groundwater. I would like to inform you that rural population in Belarus and now are using the open wells, and exactly in Brest region, the level of contamination, the groundwater, drinking water, was and now is 5 times higher than in Mogilev, where the doses to thyroid were the same, but the incidence was so different. Also, I would like to give some facts about the situation with nitrate pollution in Belarus. In period between the 1960 and 1990, use of nitrogen fertilizers in Belarus has increased by 20 times from 4 kilo per hectare till 90 kilo per hectare. Average level of nitrate in groundwater has increased from 1 to 41 milligram per liter. By the way, the maximum permitted level contaminating water with nitrate, according to the recommendation WHO, about 40 milligram. It's a very important fact to understand the situation in Belarus. Also, this situation illustrated these 3 maps. You can see that highest dosage to thyroid gland was in the south part and east part of Belarus. But the incidence of thyroid cancer among the children was the highest in the south and west part. And to understand the situation, you can see the last map where the nitrate pollution highest was exactly in the west part of Belarus. It's Brest Oblast, and the contamination water, drinking water with nitrate, about the 184 times higher than maximum permitted level. This data we published recently in +1, and we introduced the hypothesis that risk thyroid cancer related to radiation exposure can be modified by nitrate in drinking water, and effect of radiation significantly varied according to nitrate concentration in drinking water. The first health effects of nitrate were reported by Comley in 1945 after observing the baby blue syndromes in children in Iowa. What nitrate is doing with the thyroid gland? Stop nitrate, high level of nitrate in the body, in the blood, can prevent the uptake of iodine by thyroid and can compromise thyroid hormone synthesis. It's very important information. Also, in the situation with very high activity of bacteria, and also in the presence of gamma radiation, low doses of nitrate goes to the nitrosamine, and nitrosamine is a very serious cancerogen. Also, very important information that we should know that nitrate, high level in the body, can lead to high level in the body nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is involved in the numerous process and can metabolic process, and can be involved in the initiation of the numerous cancers. I would like to introduce the data. Last publication this year, its data demonstrates the meta-analysis of relationship between the dietary nitrate intake and different type of cancers. And this paper demonstrates that nitrate was inversely associated with the gastric cancer risk, but high intake of nitrate may result in the elevated cancer risk, thyroid cancer and glioma. It's very important data. Also, I would like to demonstrate the paper Mary Ward. She is maybe later will give more information about this study, but this study also demonstrates that nitrate intake high nitrate intake can lead for thyroid cancer and other thyroid disease. And also very important publication last year came from France, and scientists showed that thyroid, they investigated the second malignancy, thyroid cancer as a second malignancy after treatment, different type of childhood cancer with radiation. And they showed that patients who received nitrosuria chemotherapy had 6 times higher risk thyroid cancer than those who did not. Japanese scientists also showed that the nitric oxide is responsible for metastatic disease and progression of thyroid cancer. It's a study. And in result, we developed the hypothesis that not only radiation is responsible for development of thyroid cancer. We should every time take in account ecological situation, and the exposure of thyroid gland or salivary gland, because the metabolism of both these organs is very close to each other. Altogether in the low level of antioxidants can lead for genomic instability, and as a result we can get the situation with sharp increase in thyroid cancer cases. What is the lessons of Chernobyl? First of all, Belarusian data, Belarusian study has shown that radiation, exposure of thyroid gland was significantly associated with thyroid cancer incidence. And also we should study other factors. Our study showed that also high level of nitrate concentration in the drinking water also can be the modifier factor, and also can lead to more serious situation with the incidence of thyroid cancer. And having this podium, I would like to ask the people who is responsible for organizing new study, and the representative from UNDP, WHO, that we desperately need new study how to working together radiation and other factors, endocrine disruptors, and nitrites. We should understand more detail about how it is working together and what is the consequence we can have in the real ecological situation. And maybe if we will get more information, more data about this, we can prevent the new cases of thyroid cancer in Belarus and in the other countries. What we are doing, we continue to build new power plant station to increase production of energy. Also, we are increasingly producing nitrate fertilizer to increase our yields. What is the price of our activities? Increase in the incidence of cancer, growth in the number of people with different metabolic disease, obesity, and diabetes mellitus. As a scientist now, we are not ready to say that we should stop to build new power atom station, nuclear station, or stop to produce new nitrate fertilizer. We are talking now that we should more carefully, more strongly take account the all consequences. We need more knowledge to prevent the new accidental situation and to protect our children and new generation from the consequence and new cases of thyroid cancer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Droz, for sharing your important work and updating us on the research being done in this field. Let me invite Mr. Kolisa Mabongo, representative of the IAEA Director General, Director of the IAEA office in New York, to have some remarks.
Thank you, Chairperson. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank, on behalf of the IAEA, the government of Belarus, Project Chernobyl, and the Russian-American Foundation for organizing this event to mark the 31st anniversary of the Chernobyl accident. And today marks the first observance of the International Chernobyl Disaster Remembrance Day, declared in the General Assembly Resolution 7125, adopted in December, and entitled Persistent Legacy of the Chernobyl Disaster. As such, this day is not only one for reflection, but also one to look towards the future, post-2016. A legacy of Chernobyl for the IAEA and its member states is the profound effect it had on the way we do our work. The accident led to increased international cooperation in the area of nuclear safety and the adoption of new legal instruments. Most importantly, it focused global attention on the fact that nuclear safety can never be taken for granted, and that there is no room for complacency in this regard. We were also reminded that technology is a human endeavor, and that no technology is 100% safe. Nuclear is no exception. In the past 3 decades, the IAEA Technical Cooperation Program has provided over $15 million in assistance to the affected regions, primarily through national and regional projects. As noted in our contribution to the latest report of the Secretary General on Chernobyl, we have provided specialized technical expertise, training and equipment in the areas of environmental remediation, decommissioning and management of radioactive waste, sustainable agricultural production in contaminated areas, and human health, just to mention a few. Much of this support has been provided in partnership with other organizations of the United Nations. Regional IAEA technical cooperation activities resulted in the harmonization of national concepts, documents, and decision-making tools for the rehabilitation and return to radiological environmental conditions of the affected areas in Belarus, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine. Approaches to the radiation protection of the public were also harmonized. All work was based on international recommendations and international safety standards. Human resource capacities in Ukraine and Belarus were strengthened through the training of professionals in radiological monitoring, remediation, and recovery in the affected areas. In addition, campaigns focused on improving awareness of rehabilitation and safety issues among the general population, allowing for the return to normal life conditions in the affected territory. This was achieved through a dedicated website and various other outreach efforts. At the national level, capacities in Belarus for optimal forest management were enhanced through radiological monitoring and the monitoring of decreasing radiation risks from contaminated forests, enabling gradual use of the forests for economic activity. Through IAEA projects, Belarus has improved its capacity to use environmentally sound agricultural remediation technologies, contributing to animal farms in affected regions becoming economically usable. Projects to make water potable have led to an overall improvement in the quality of life. IAEA activities have also built capacity in Belarus to prevent selected radionuclides from entering the food chain, contributing to the well-being of the population of the affected areas. Through the joint FAO-IAEA Division on Nuclear Technologies in Food and Agriculture, the IAEA supports research on techniques for sustainable agricultural production, including in areas affected by radioactive contamination, with emphasis on the development of remediation countermeasures, methods for monitoring radioactive contaminants in agricultural land and water, contaminant analysis, data management, and the development of remediation techniques and technologies. In the health sector, radiotherapy services for oncological patients from the Chernobyl-affected areas in Belarus and Ukraine have improved with the introduction of new techniques, equipment, and training. In Ukraine, expert assistance and training was provided for decommissioning of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and for assistance with the shelter and waste management systems. Looking forward, the IAEA Technical Cooperation Program supports 3 projects: a regional project on radiological management of the abandoned areas, a national project in Belarus for transuranium assessment, and a national project in Ukraine on decommissioning and radioactive waste management at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Support is expected to continue throughout the 2018-2019 period, building on past assistance. Protecting the natural environment, human health, food security are fundamental components of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, as are the partnerships needed to implement the agenda. Nuclear, isotopic, and related analytical techniques and technology are valuable tools for gaining an understanding of these issues. The IAEA supports member states in enhancing their capacities to use these advanced scientific techniques and tools to tackle threats to the environment, human health, and to food security. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Babongo. I'd like to invite Matthew Dalbo, Counselor for Economic and Social Affairs, United States Mission to the United Nations.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few words today on the occasion of the first International Chernobyl Remembrance Day on the 31st anniversary of the Chernobyl accident. I'd like to thank the chair, as well as Project Chernobyl, Belarus, and all of the member states and officials who are gathered here today. The purpose of this Remembrance Day, as provided in the resolution of the 71st UN General Assembly establishing it, is to raise awareness of the long-term consequences of the Chernobyl disaster, and indeed continuing to monitor and study not only the security of the reactor site itself, but also the health of those affected by the disaster is critical to providing compassionate support. And it increases our understanding of how to prevent future accidents and ensure the safe and secure use of nuclear power as more countries express interest in developing it. The Memorandum of Understanding among the G7, the European Commission, and Ukraine on the closure of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, signed on December 20th, 1995, reflected our commitment to support Ukraine in returning the damaged Unit 4 reactor site to an environmentally safe and stable condition. In the past year, we have achieved the most significant milestone to date in such efforts with the positioning of the new safe confinement over the destroyed Unit 4 reactor in November 2016. Efforts to rehabilitate the site have been and remain a high priority for the United States, and we are committed to seeing them through. The Chernobyl Shelter Fund, or CSF, was set up at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in 1997 to fund construction of the confinement structure that encloses the deteriorating Soviet-era sarcophagus hastily constructed after the 1986 accident. 27 countries and the European Commission are contributors to the fund, and the United States is the largest bilateral donor to the CSF and has historically provided 21.8% of the total G7 EU amount that was donated. The most visible project thus far is the Chernobyl New Safe Confinement Structure, which encloses the deteriorating Soviet-era sarcophagus, protects the reactor site from radiological release for the next 100 years, and enables the remote deconstruction of the sarcophagus. Never before has there such a large structure been assembled under comparable circumstances at a heavily contaminated site. And work on the new safe confinement took 6 years to complete. But more challenges remain in securing the Chernobyl plant on a long-term basis. The EBRD nuclear safety account, set up in 1993 at the initiative of the G7 to provide safety assistance to countries operating Soviet-designed reactors, was extended to support Ukraine in 1995. And the NSA is funding construction of the interim spent fuel storage facility, the ISF-2, that will provide dry storage for the more than 20,000 spent fuel assemblies from the 3 undamaged reactors at Chernobyl. The ISF-1 structure, which currently holds the spent fuel, is deteriorating rapidly and must be replaced in order to prevent severe environmental damage or additional radioactive releases. Continued deterioration will eventually lead to the release of radioactive contamination. The delivery of all 231 storage casks needed to store the spent fuel remaining in the plant is scheduled for April of 2019. Funds from the April 2016 Nuclear Safety Account pledge event should be sufficient to avoid premature termination of the ISF-2 project, and would avoid, therefore, a serious safety risk due to the deterioration of the spent fuel rods, which are currently stored in ponds awaiting transfer to a completed ISF-2 structure. All of us here have a vested interest in seeing that these projects are completed successfully. Thus far, the international community under G7 leadership has spent over 1 billion euros for construction and design, in addition to our political commitments and pledges. By confining the aging sarcophagus to protect the surrounding environment and securing the spent fuel, the plant can be decommissioned, putting the most immediate potential hazards of this legacy behind us. And these contributions, as we all know, are extremely important because we are more dependent on nuclear power now than we were in 1986. And today, nuclear energy plays a vital role in meeting and diversifying the world's energy needs. Nuclear energy provides the Ukraine, as an example, with almost half of its energy and can play an important role in member states' plans to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. As we pause here today to reflect on the events of April 26, 1986, and their impact on the people who were affected for the rest of their lives, we reflect too on the commitment of the international community to mitigate the effects of the Chernobyl accident. The renewed commitment of the international community to nuclear safety, as we've been discussing here today, must be an essential part of that reflection if we are to properly honor the memory of the victims of the accident and the heroism of those who lost their lives in responding to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Dalba. I'd like to invite Dr. Mary Ward. Dr. Ward is a senior investigator, National Cancer Institute Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics, Occupation and Environmental. Her title is Nitrate in Drinking Water and Cancer, Appraising the Evidence. Dr. Ward.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today on this important day of remembrance and to talk a little bit about my research. I was asked to speak about nitrate and cancer, nitrate in drinking water and cancer in particular, with the idea of potentially doing future research in the Chernobyl-affected area. So as Dr. Drost spoke a little bit about, the human population has had large impacts on the global nitrogen cycle. You can see from this graph that since about 1950, there's been very large increases in reactive nitrogen, mostly in the form of chemical nitrogen fertilizers. That's the blue line going up. And as a result of that, the total nitrogen inputs into the environment by humans have now exceeded that of natural nitrogen fixation. This has resulted in increasing levels of nitrate in our water resources around the world. So mostly due to nitrogen fertilizers, but also due to animal and human waste. And as was mentioned, there's a regulatory limit for nitrate in our drinking water supplies. In the USA, that limit is 10 milligrams per liter is nitrate, counting only the nitrogen, and that's roughly equivalent to the EU and WHO regulatory level of 50 milligrams per liter is nitrate, the ion. The highest exposures, because nitrate is regulated in public water supplies mostly, it's the highest exposures are among the population using private wells, which in the United States are not regulated. And there's not a lot of measurement data to try to assess exposure. I'll be talking a little bit about that at the end of my talk. But why do we care about nitrate ingested from drinking water or from diet? That's because in the body, it's absorbed in the bloodstream and excreted through an active transport system into the saliva, where oral bacteria then reduce nitrate to nitrite. It's swallowed, and then in the acidic stomach environment forms these nitrosating agents that can react with amines and amides that are commonly found in the diet to form nitroso compounds. And these, as Dr. Drost mentioned, are potent animal carcinogens and putative human carcinogens. This reaction can be increased in the presence of heme iron found in red meat, and it is known to be inhibited very successfully by higher levels of antioxidants, such as vitamin C. We also know that nitrate inhibits iodide uptake by the thyroid, and this inhibition has been shown to decrease levels of thyroid hormones, resulting in an increase in levels of thyroid-stimulating hormone. And as I'll show you in a minute, there's been a number of cross-sectional studies that have linked higher nitrate levels in drinking water to thyroid disease. So these studies, which have been mostly cross-sectional, just a few examples here, have pretty consistently shown that elevated nitrate levels in drinking water are associated with thyroid conditions like thyroid hypertrophy in women, and a study in the Netherlands among women. High nitrate levels in water supplies in Slovakia were associated with subclinical hypothyroidism in children. And in a study that we did in the United States, in Pennsylvania, in a cohort of Amish people, we found that higher nitrate levels in private wells were associated with a higher prevalence of subclinical hypothyroidism measured by TSH levels in the blood among women but not men. The WHO, International Agency for Research on Cancer, evaluated the evidence for ingested nitrate and nitrite in relation to cancer a number of years ago. The literature was reviewed through 2006, and the monograph was published in 2010. I'm going to just briefly touch on the evidence from that review, including the animal studies, the human mechanistic studies, and the epidemiologic studies focusing on drinking water. Animal studies were quite convincing that nitroso compounds cause cancer. Over 300 nitroso compounds have been tested in animal studies, and 90% were found to be carcinogens. And this was the case for over 30 animal species, including all species of non-human primates. Nitroso compounds cause tumors in multiple organs, as shown here, including the thyroid. And that's true for individual nitroso compounds that animals were dosed with, as well as for feeding animals nitrite with an amine source, which is how we would be exposed, mostly in our diet. The human mechanistic studies clearly demonstrate that humans will, first of all, reduce nitrate to nitrite, again, as I mentioned, by the oral bacterial primarily, and that drinking water nitrate can increase endogenous formation of nitroso compounds. This has been shown in a number of controlled feeding studies, and the elevated nitroso compounds have been seen largely at levels exceeding the current maximum contaminant level for nitrate. But one study showed no such increase at levels below that MCL. Another, again, feeding study showed that in humans showed that nitrate intake via drinking water, along with an amine source, in this case a meal of fish, increased the excretion of NDMA, which is a carcinogenic nitroso compound. So in terms of the epidemiology studies, the scientists reviewed the evidence for dietary nitrate and nitrite and concluded that dietary nitrate is, there was inadequate evidence for a relationship with cancer, and most studies had focused on stomach and esophagus cancer and generally showed an inverse or no association. Now, the major source of dietary nitrate comes from green, leafy, and root vegetables. These also have protective micronutrients that have, again, in human biomonitoring studies, have been shown to inhibit this formation of nitroso compounds in the body. There was limited evidence for dietary nitrite, especially from processed meats. And again, at the time of the monograph review, most studies were of stomach and esophagus cancer, and most showed positive associations. Since that review, there have been additional cancer sites that have shown increased risk with dietary nitrite from processed meats, including the colorectum, kidney, ovary, and thyroid. For the drinking water studies, it was concluded there was inadequate evidence of carcinogenicity in humans for nitrate in drinking water. And I have a quote here from the monograph review that epidemiologic studies of any one cancer site were few. Exposure levels tended to be low because they were mostly focusing on public water supplies, and endogenous nitrisation factors were not often considered. Now, since that monograph, since that literature was reviewed a little over 10 years ago, there have been additional studies that have seen positive associations with stomach, colon, and kidney cancers, no association with brain and bladder. But I know of particular interest is what do we know about thyroid cancer and thyroid conditions. So I want to just talk about some recent and ongoing research at the National Cancer Institute, where we're looking at drinking water nitrate and cancer in 2 cohorts. I'll be showing some results from the Iowa Women's Health Study, which is a cohort of older women in Iowa, which is a highly intensely agricultural state in the U.S. 73% of the women used public supplies, 25% were on private wells at their home, and a small percent on bottled water. The other study is the Agricultural Health Study, which is a study of 90,000 pesticide applicators and their spouses, also in Iowa and another agricultural state, North Carolina. And in this cohort, it's quite unique because the large majority of the participants use private wells for their drinking water source. And as I mentioned, those aren't regulated, so we don't have good measurement data on the cohort. So I'll just be talking briefly about how we're assessing exposure for this cohort by using GIS-based models. So first, the Iowa Women's Health Study is located, as you can see here, in an area with high inputs of nitrogen. This is kind of the upper Midwestern part of the United States, sometimes called the Corn Belt, and there's a lot of nitrogen fertilizer use on corn crops in particular. We had information on their drinking water source and duration of how long they use that source. The cohort was, that information was obtained in 1989. And we assessed exposure for the women who were using public water supply by linking a public database of monitoring measurements of nitrate as well as disinfection byproducts measured as trihalomethanes. We linked those to the city of residence of the woman. There were over 470 cities, and we linked also by the duration that they were living at that home. We calculated exposure metrics, including the average level of the nitrate in their drinking water and also the trihalomethanes, and the years they were exposed at half the maximum contaminant level or above. So this was a very stable population. Over 82% of the women had used their water supply for more than 16 years. So what did we find for drinking water and thyroid cancer and thyroid disease? To my knowledge, this is the first study that evaluated drinking water nitrate and these health outcomes. We found that thyroid cancer and dietary nitrate was associated with an increased risk of thyroid cancer. These are approximate quartiles of intake in milligrams per day, with the highest group showing an almost threefold increased risk in thyroid cancer. I should say this was based on only 40 cases at the time we did this study in 2009. Nitrate in drinking water was also associated with an increased risk of thyroid cancer, with about a 2-fold increased risk in the highest quartile of exposure. That's a long-term average exposure to nitrate in their drinking water. There was no, we didn't have information on levels in private wells, but there was not an increased risk among the group who used private wells for their drinking water. We also saw that there was an increase in prevalence of hypothyroidism among women who had higher drinking water and dietary nitrate levels. This is summed their intake from both diet and drinking water. And that was adjusted for known risk factors for hypothyroidism. So that's basically the summary to my knowledge, of the literature on this topic for drinking water and nitrate and thyroid cancer and thyroid disease. I'd just like to talk a little bit about some other cancers. We've been, again, following this cohort and evaluating a number of cancer sites, and the strongest associations to date have been for ovarian and bladder cancers. With over 20 years of follow-up, we have over 300 ovarian cancer cases and 263 bladder cancer cases. We were able to look at other drinking water contaminants like trihalomethanes, as I mentioned, and assess interaction by factors like vitamin C and red meat, as well as smoking. We also assessed intake of dietary nitrate from processed meats and other sources. For ovarian cancer, we saw an increased risk with increasing average nitrate levels in the public water supply and an elevated risk among women who use private wells. When we stratified by their intake of vitamin C, which again can inhibit the formation of nitroso compounds, we saw that among women who had higher vitamin C intakes, there was no elevation in risk with increasing average nitrate levels in the water. But among women who had lower vitamin C intakes, indeed, there was a significant positive trend in risk and also a significant elevated risk among women who use private wells for their drinking water. And this interaction was statistically significant. We also found that bladder cancer risk was increased among women who, this shows the metric of looking at duration of years above half the maximum contaminant level. And when we adjusted for trihalomethanes, which are a known bladder cancer risk factor, we did not see any change in risk. So it seemed to be an independent association with nitrate. Some additional analyses that we've done included kidney cancer, where we saw an increased risk with average nitrate levels and years over half the MCL. But for colon, rectum, and pancreas cancer, we've seen no associations with drinking water nitrate level in the cohort. So these kind of exposures are somewhat difficult to follow up on because although nitrate is a common water contaminant, you really have to go to study populations in agricultural rural areas of the country or world to really assess these exposures. So we are looking at this in the agricultural health study cohort, which is, as I mentioned, study of applicators and pesticide applicators and their spouses in Iowa and North Carolina. And the large majority use private wells for their drinking water, but we do not have measurement data for those wells. So we took an approach of using a GIS-based, Geographic Information System-based model to estimate nitrate in their private wells. We know various factors such as the depth of the well, land use, particularly corn agriculture, the presence of animal feeding operations near a well, and the aspects of the geology are all predictive of nitrate in the groundwater. So using this modeling approach, a particular type of model, random forest, actually performed better than linear regression. We found that 66 variables explained 77% of the variation in the nitrate concentration, and I've just listed some of the key variables here in terms of in their order of importance for predicting nitrate. So this model is published, and we are in the process of applying it to the cohort. This shows just what the exposure pattern looks like for the cohort. There's nitrogen applications across all of Iowa. There's corn agriculture pretty much every county in Iowa, but you can see the pattern of higher nitrate, which is the kind of the deeper colored dots, is really quite not uniform at all. It's highest in the western part of the state, that's shallow wells in the top map. And in the deeper wells, you see the contamination in the northeast part of the state where there's the karst geology. So in terms of ongoing research, in the Iowa Women's Health Study, we also hope to estimate levels for women using private wells, and we're doing additional analyses, including gastrointestinal tract cancers. And in the Agricultural Health Study, we will be conducting analyses of all of these cancers here, including thyroid cancer and thyroid disease. And hopefully these results should help clarify cancer risk at levels between 5 and 10 milligrams per liter and above the MCL, which the Agricultural Health Study cohort has exposure above those levels. So just a little bit about future studies and research needs. Certainly, we need to evaluate additional factors that influence endogenous nitration. The oral microbiome can be measured in saliva or buccal cell samples from epidemiologic studies, from study populations. You can also incorporate biomarkers to measure urinary levels of nitroso compounds and nitrate. And certainly, it's very intriguing, this idea to evaluate the interaction with radiation exposure and its potential effects on thyroid disease and thyroid cancer. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge a few of my co-authors on some of these studies I presented.
Thank you very much, Dr. Work, for this presentation, and also want to commend you on your really groundbreaking work in this field. I'd like to invite Kathleen Ryan, Chairperson of U.S. Board at Chernobyl Children International.
Thank you for inviting me, and heartfelt thanks to all of you here for your commitment, for your hard work, for your willingness to find your own particular areas of expertise, and particularly thank you to the scientists and researchers that are giving us good hard information to base our decisions on. I'd like to describe the experience that we've had as an NGO working in communities affected by the Chernobyl disaster, and how that approach has changed dramatically over time. Chernobyl Children International started in Ireland as an emergency aid organization, and in fact, we delivered over 100 million euro in aid through convoys that traveled across Europe by truck, and we brought over 25,000 children from contaminated communities to Ireland for summer and winter holidays. But as the time passed from since the Chernobyl disaster, the needs of the people affected changed, and we changed our approach as well. From those times of delivering humanitarian aid, we developed relationships of trust and familiarity, and we were able to develop those relationships to build partnerships over the years. And we evolved to become a network of local partnerships in training, medical intervention, and capacity building. And I'd like to mention a few of the best examples of that approach. One would be our children's cardiac surgery program. When we went into Minsk in 2002 and visited the cardiac surgery center, the head of surgery described to us in tears that there were 7,000 children waiting for cardiac surgery, and that while they were well able to do surgeries on adults, that operating on children was in fact a very particular thing. They did not have the expertise, and that of those 7,000 children, they expected most of them would die without surgery. He even showed us a dog-eared, worn-out medical textbook that showed how to operate on children, and said, this is what we have to go on. So we partnered with the United States Novik Cardiac Alliance, and we started to bring teams of surgeons into Minsk. They worked side by side with their Belarusian counterparts. We provided surgeries, and we provided training. And within a couple years, the waiting list for surgeries was down by half. And today, there is no waiting list. And in fact, the surgeons at the Children's Cardiosurgery of Minsk have world-class skills. They're able to handle their own needs, and they're even able to provide expertise to other programs. Where we went next was Ukraine. We worked we have been working in Kharkiv at the Kharkiv Center for Cardiac Surgery for 5 years. And the same thing, going in with volunteer surgeons. We've provided training, we've provided equipment, and we're ready to move on and do something similar in Kiev. Our partners in this were the respective hospitals, along with the Novik Cardiac Alliance, and we invested over $1 million, and our investment actually attracted a U.S. State Department grant of $500,000. So the program was able to save directly over 4,000 children's lives. That's just through surgery, but since there was a training component, the teams were able to save lives year-round, even when we weren't there, and we also helped the hospitals develop local sources of funding so that the program would be sustainable over time. Another example was our work in building community centers. Dr. Menanabi spoke very movingly of some of the mental health needs in the wake of the disaster and how persistent they could be. And so we worked with the local departments of social protection in 10 areas, including Glutsk, Zikovici, and Petrikov, and we either built or refurbished community centers there. Each of the centers serves populations of over 60,000 people, and they're able to be focal points for social services, educational services, medical outreach, in areas that are most affected by poverty and high rates of disability. Some of the sorts of programs that are able to be run from these community centers include thyroid, breast cancer, and AIDS screening, physical therapy, childhood literacy, and elder care services. And they're now able to serve as a base for the next program I'd like to talk about, and that is deinstitutionalization of children and young adults. We strongly support the basic right of people with disability to live independently and in their communities and not segregated from society and institutions. In Glutsk, we've pioneered a number of projects that are pathways to independent living for young adults with disabilities who've spent their entire lives in orphanages. And we could not have done this without the support of the Department of Social Protection in Glutsk. We recently formalized this approach with a memorandum of understanding between CCI, the Mogilev Department of Social Protection, Glutsk Community Center, and the Belarusian NGO World Without Borders that will provide a path of life skills, literacy, and numeracy training for institutionalized young children that will step them through the process of living independently and finally even going to court to become emancipated and to have their rights restored to them and even provide them with suitable jobs inside the community. This is, again, another example of how as an NGO you need to work with local partners in order to get this sort of thing done. You just can't do it alone. We also, in partnership with the Department of Health, established in the #1 baby home in Minsk, a baby hospice. It's a place for families to stay together during the final days of their child. We were able to contribute outside expertise from the Ireland and the United States where hospice programs are a bit more established, and combine that with the local cultures and ways of thinking to provide a program that they can run over time. We also have developed foster homes for children who come from such severe backgrounds of neglect and abuse that it simply wouldn't be possible to hope to keep them with their families. This program also leverages our system of community centers. We have worked with the Department of Education and established 21 of these foster homes throughout Mogilev and Gomel, and these aren't really in and out revolving door fostering situations. These are really very permanent homes, and many of the children in these homes have been adopted. And finally, I just wanted to give an example of a program that we call a community care program. We didn't work with any of the government institutions, but we did hire and train local health care professionals to provide support for families that really fell through some of the cracks, who really only had the option of institutionalization because their child was so profoundly disabled, but who did not want to institutionalize their child. We provide home health visits, training, physical therapy programs so that those families are able to stay together. Underscoring our theme of partnership, these are examples of programs that have only become successful because they were developed in local partnership. They were built on a personal, person-to-person familiarity, trust, and shared commitment that by working together we can solve complicated problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ryan, for sharing with us the important work of your organization. I'd like to invite our last speaker of the day, Dr. Yuri Nikiforov. Dr. Nikiforov is a professor of pathology and Vice Chair of the Department of Pathology, Director, Division of Molecular and Genomic Pathology in Pittsburgh. His presentation today is Molecular Genetic Studies in the Post-Chernobyl Period, Achievements in Basic and Clinical Research and Importance of the Continuation of Scientific Research on the Medical Consequences of Chernobyl. Dr. Nikiforov.
Thank you, Dr. Branovan. I want to start expressing my appreciation to the government of Belarus, the Project Chernobyl and Russian-American Foundation for organizing this important event on the first Remembrance Day of Chernobyl and inviting me to share with you an overview, hopefully a brief overview of molecular genetic study, mostly on thyroid cancer developing after Chernobyl. Looking at the literature, available literature on Chernobyl and genetic studies, I mean, here is statistics. I just double-checked it today in the morning. Overall, if we look at the PubMed is a repository of all biomedical literature, sort of available mostly in English-speaking, English language publications. There are about 4,632 publications with the name of Chernobyl. And genetics, if I would cross-reference with genetics, I was able to identify 594. So about 10 to 15% of the literature is focused on the genetic aspects of the Chernobyl accident and post-Chernobyl diseases and cancer particularly. So why genetics is important? As you probably know, cancer is in general a genetic disease. It develops as a result of damage in the cellular DNA that is inappropriately repaired by defensive mechanisms that exist in each individual. So understanding of the genetic mechanism of any disease like cancer, first of all, allows us to develop measures how to prevent or minimize the effect of the disease. And also the understanding of the genetics of predisposition to disease would have very significant importance on the understanding which individuals actually are more susceptible to certain diseases or certain events, for example, radiation-induced cancer, and has to be protected most in the events when such accidents happen. So first questions that scientists try to address studying post-Chernobyl thyroid cancer is genetic mechanisms of Chernobyl cancer are different from something that happened without radiation exposure. Lots of information has been accumulated overall on the genetic mechanism of thyroid cancer, and we know that of different classes of genetic events, which are either very small-scale abnormalities in DNA, we call point mutations, or very large-scale chromosome breakage and repair, which is called gene rearrangements. So point mutations are the most common mechanism of sporadic thyroid cancer, cancers that happened without known environmental factors. And the first studies dating back to 1994, when the scientists look at the small populations of post-Chernobyl thyroid cancer. This is a study from Belarus, published in Belarus, and actually some couple cases from Ukraine, published in Lancet in 1994, shows that the gene fusions or gene rearrangements, which is a large-scale genetic event, were most common in these post-Chernobyl thyroid cancers. And since then, a large number of publications have appeared studying this phenomenon, with basically confirming this first observation. This is a study of 191 post-Chernobyl papillary carcinomas from Belarus, showing that the vast majority of genetic events in those cancers are these large-scale genetic alterations or chromosome breakage and incorrect repair, which are called in this situation red PTC rearrangements. So by 2005, there was a very large body of literature accumulating in the area that allows us to suggest that there is a fundamental difference in biological and genetic mechanisms of sporadic thyroid cancer and cancer that develops as a result of
radiation exposure, in particular in this situation is post-Chernobyl radiation. So very sporadic thyroid cancer develops through, again, a mechanism of very small scale, just single nucleotide changes in DNA. The radiation-induced cancer is initiated by these large-scale chromosomal abnormalities, chromosomal rearrangements. And this was further substantiated, confirmed more recently when one of the research group looked at thyroid cancers in patients who were exposed at Chernobyl and those who were born after Chernobyl from the same regions in this situation of Ukrainian patients, showing that really mutational profiles were completely different in these two groups of thyroid cancer, virtually providing undisputable evidence that the gene rearrangements represent a molecular mechanism of radiation-induced thyroid cancer. What was really missing from the study was association with radiation dose, and this information is also now become available. If one look at thyroid cancer and this is information from the Ukrainian-American cohort study, if someone look at the relationship between point mutations and gene fusions and radiation dose, there is a very strong direct correlation between the increase in radiation dose, specifically dose from radioactive iodine-131, and the presence of gene fusions. However, this study that is currently being sort of reviewed for publication has shown a number of other quite interesting pieces of information. For example, there was an association between the predominance of this sort of marker events of radiation-induced cancer, such as gene fusions, with gender. For example, males were more likely to have them than females. With the age at exposure, and particularly with residence in specific areas in the situation of Ukraine. So even after adjustment for radiation exposure. So we have been discussing today already the possible impact of different environmental factors other than radiation. I mean, probably one of them should be iodine deficiency, but definitely not limited to iodine deficiency. And there is at least significant likelihood that in addition to radiation, other environmental factor may modulate the progress of carcinogenesis that was initially sort of initiated by ionizing radiation, modify and maybe accelerate this process, and those factors needs to be studied. So by now, overall, looking at the genetic mechanisms of radiation-induced cancer, there is a quite solid data indicating that, again, since after the radiation exposure that it directly damages nuclear DNA to development of thyroid cancer, chromosomal rearrangements provide this sort of mechanistical links between these two events. However, it remains still unclear what is the exact mechanism of generation of these chromosomal rearrangements. There are a number of factors within the cell and within the body that affects the formation of this abnormal fusion of chromosomes that results in chromosomal rearrangement. One of those factors is a need for DNA breaks, and that's what radiation does. It basically chops DNA and provides a first sort of factor needed for formation of these abnormal breaks. Then there is a special spatial proximity of potentially recombinogenic foci in the nucleus. And then there is a specific DNA sequence and chromatin structures that predispose certain regions of DNA to be more vulnerable, and then abnormal DNA repair. So a number of studies have been focusing on the role of nuclear architecture on the predisposition to radiation carcinogenesis. So it has been established that in order for two pieces of chromosome to be abnormally fused and results in the events that promote carcinogenesis, they have to be located close to each other in the nuclear volume. And indeed, it has been shown that in normal thyroid cells, there are specific chromosomal regions that do locate it in close proximity in the nucleus. And this likely provides a genetic mechanism why thyroid cells are so susceptible for ionizing radiation, because this event is cell-specific and not all cells within the human body have this prerequisite, this predisposition to be abnormally fused with respect to specific chromosomal regions. So further work also needs to be done to better understand the exact mechanism of chromosomal rearrangement formation after radiation exposure. Specifically, it remains unclear is one break within the DNA is sufficient to initiate this abnormal fusion, or two breaks are needed, or perhaps no breaks is needed, and there is an indirect mechanism how radiation exposure leads to formation of these chromosomal rearrangements. Better understanding of this mechanism will help us to develop measures how we can prevent such type of DNA damage and then prevent the development of thyroid and other type of cancers in patients who have been exposed to ionizing radiation. Another very important mechanism of biomedical research, not mechanism, but area of biomedical research is to understand the genetic predisposition to radiation-induced thyroid cancer. There is a virtually full consensus in the scientific field that the genetic predisposition to radiation-induced carcinogenesis exists. That if you take 10 individuals and expose them to the same dose of radiation, only 1 or 2 will develop cancer, and the rest will correctly repair DNA damage and will not develop it. So why is that? It is at least some early evidence suggests that there's very specific weakness in the particular types of DNA repair would predispose such individuals to abnormal, again, fusion of pieces of chromosome, which would result in this event that will then stimulate carcinogenesis. There are very limited data available at this time. Also, some studies that I show here do look into this. And overall, this area of genetic medicine is still at a relatively early stage. But there is a general belief that with time, with development of and really sort of expansion of genomic science, and that's what the current state of science we live in, it will result in sequencing genome of virtually all individuals, and then better understanding what really, what is the set of genetic markers that makes this individual more susceptible to ionizing, to developing cancer after exposure to ionizing radiation. Again, understanding of this would help us to select those individuals that should not be involved in any kind of measures. Well, first of all, that professionally should not be involved in professions associated with sort of, you know, higher dose of ionizing radiation, or involved in the consequence, in the liquidated the consequences of radiation exposure, and have to be pretty much taken care first in case of the accidents, because those individuals are expected to be more susceptible to radiation-induced carcinogenesis. So, and I would like just to finish summarizing few of the lessons that we've learned after Chernobyl. Many of them we've discussed already today. I mean, this 31 years after this horrible disaster, we know now without any sort of doubts that environmental exposure to a radioactive iodine 131 during childhood particularly leads to an increased risk of thyroid cancer, and this risk is dose dependent. We know that now minimal latent period for thyroid cancer is very short, is 4 years. That's what Dr. Drost was describing as the experience, and I was witness of this experience but myself. At the beginning, it was so short that it was really disbelieved that this cancer can be associated with radiation exposure. We know now that youngest children are more susceptible and have to be really taken care and limited, I mean, exposure should be limited most to this sort of most vulnerable populations. In terms of the molecular mechanisms, there is a strong data suggesting that chromosome breakage and generation of gene fusions is the fundamental molecular mechanism of radiation-induced thyroid cancer. And we also know that nuclear architecture of specific cell types predisposed to recurrent intra- and interchromosomal rearrangement after exposure to ionizing radiation. And this probably provides a mechanism why thyroid cells are so susceptible to radiation-induced carcinogenesis. In terms of kind of new directions of future goals, I believe that more work needs to be done on understanding of individual genetic predisposition to radiation-induced carcinogenesis. Role of iodine deficiency needs to be further studied. It's a very significant, it is likely to be a very significant sort of modifying factor for dose in individuals exposed to ionizing radiation. And role of other environmental factors, the interaction with radiation-induced DNA damage in carcinogenesis is an important factor that needs to be further studied. Thank you.
Dr. Niver, thank you so much for your comprehensive review of the work in the field. As we can conclude this roundtable discussion, I'd like to begin the remarks by thanking a number of people that made this work possible. I'd like to thank my partners in sponsoring and arranging this presentation, the Permanent Mission of Belarus to United Nations, ably led by His Excellency Andrei Dapkiunas, Russian-American Foundation, led by Marina Kovalyova. I'd like to thank all the presenters. I think you all were impressed by the breadth and the diversity of the presenters at this table, both hearing from the representatives of the nations affected by the Chernobyl nuclear accident and nations who've experienced radiation contamination. I think we've all learned that the key point from their presentation is that these countries are all open for international cooperation and indeed are making plans for projects and opportunities for further cooperation. And it is our one of the goals of this discussion is to advance these projects and ideas. We've had a very comprehensive discussion and presentations by UN agencies involved in the field, and some of the key aspects that I have taken away from this, and I believe you as well, is that the agencies certainly fully understand the extreme enormity of the damage and the impact that the Chernobyl nuclear accident had not only on those affected nations, but also throughout the world in our understanding both the physical and the psychological effects of the nuclear accident, and certainly has had a tremendous impact on the way we perceive nuclear energy, nuclear power, and other new disruptive technologies. And finally, the tremendous thanks to the scientific presenters. I think all of us have had a rare opportunity to really be briefed on the the forefront, the newest and the most recent studies in the field relating radiation exposure and other factors such as neuroendocrine disruptors as it relates to development of cancer, and in this case specifically thyroid cancer. And I think this is the field that is just beginning, and certainly the scientific community is very aware of the tremendous possibilities in learning how radiation exposure, be that through horrendous accidents or through exposure in our everyday lives through testing and treatments, how that might impact on development of cancer. And finally, special thanks to other NGOs who shared the podium with us and shared with us some of the tremendous work that we're doing. My special thanks to all of the audience members who've taken the time to be with us today. This is our second annual roundtable discussion, and as we continue in this journey, I think all of us appreciate the tremendous benefit that all of the people involved are receiving from bringing people to this table from various perspectives, from various fields, from around the world to share in their work and to help move this process forward. As we conclude this roundtable discussion, I'd like to invite you, if you're able, to come one floor upstairs and share with us the opening of the photo documentary exhibition. It is called You're Not Alone, Celebrating the Healing Power of Empathy and Compassion in the Face of Tragedy. And that opening ceremony is scheduled for 6 o'clock. Again, many thanks to all of you. Thank you to all of the organizers, presenters, and we hope to see you again in a year.